I think we're going to get going here. For all of you punctual people, we don't want to wait for the slow pokes. Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thank you for being here on this last day of the ISRI 2017 convention. Oh my gosh, I see somebody I know there. This is the What's New in the World Scrap Trade session. So you all must be very interested in the future because this is what this is all about. We're very, very lucky to have a speaker of Adam Minter's caliber joining us today. I've got a nice, decently long bio about Adam, so I hope you'll listen and realize how important this gentleman is. Adam Minter lives in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, where he writes a column on Asia for Bloomberg View. From 2002 to 2014, he was based in Shanghai, China, and wrote on Chinese business, culture, and above all, the global scrap industry. In addition to writing for recycling industry publications that include Scrap and Recycling International, his work has been featured in National Geographic, Smithsonian, the Wall Street Journal, the Los Angeles Times, Bloomberg Business Week, Scientific American, and other publications. Ooh, that's a mouthful. As an aside, he started writing for Scrap. By the way, I am Kent Kaiser, publisher of Scrap Magazine for ISRI. So I know this gentleman quite well. We've known each other since 2002. That's when he started writing for Scrap, and he's won numerous awards for his features on the scrap industries of various countries. We've sent Adam all over the world, and he's always given us a great story about what's going on in the various countries. For his 2003 series titled Scrap in China, he won the Stephen Barr Award for individual feature writing from the American Society of Business Publication Editors. That group praised that feature series for its inventiveness, insight, depth, balance, and impact. In 2013, Bloomsbury published his first book, Junkyard Planet. I don't know how many of you all have read that, but if you haven't, pick it up. It's a great book. Travels in the billion-dollar trash trade. He is hard at work on his second book and chasing after his 2.5-year-old son, Samuel. And it is a personal pleasure for me to introduce Adam because we are good friends as well. So please, give your ears and your attention to Adam, and he'll tell you, hopefully, what's going to happen in the future, and then think about some questions afterward. We'll have a Q&A. Thank you very much. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm getting a signal to also please abide by the antitrust guidelines that are in that attractive brochure in front of you. No talking prices. Just listen and learn from Adam. Thank you.
Well, let's see here. Good afternoon, everybody. This is an honor, Kent, to have that in. I'm just going to return the favor here. I don't think I've ever been on stage with Kent, but I think it's really no exaggeration to say that my career, whatever career I've had, is due in large part to the fact that Kent gave me a shot for really no good reason very early on. And so I don't think I've ever been able to say that publicly in front of people, but it's true. Without Kent, I would definitely be in a very different place. So that's actually a short way of saying if you don't like anything I say today, it's all his fault. So, all right, well, I am going to, we're going to go through the past, we're going to go through the present, we're going to go through the future a little bit. And I'm going to start by going to the past. I want to pick up on a point I made actually last year at the Spotlight on Electronics, and I want to just extend it a little bit as we get into this, because I think it's relevant to a lot of the different sectors of the scrap industry going forward. We don't have the music. I wish we did. But you know, if we want to understand the future of scrap trade, we're going to need to understand the past a little bit. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to go into that long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, and we're going to look at some junkyards in Star Wars. The interesting thing about Star Wars is it's filled with scrap. And it's filled with trash being ejected from ships, stuff being thrown in piles. This is from Episode 1. That's Liam Neeson walking through a scrapyard, I believe, on Tatooine. Then we go to Episode 4 here. That's the sand crawler, and those are the Jawas. They're scrappers. They're going out and picking up whatever metal they can find on Tatooine. They always remind me of my Eastern European Jewish scrapping relatives a little bit, just scurrying around and snapping at each other. But it's a real scrap business. They're scavenging and finding whatever they can. The interesting thing about Star Wars, though, is that you never see anybody smelting anything. Everything is sort of put aside for some kind of repair later later on. And that's what we have inside the sand crawler. And it's kind of interesting. At one point, I started thinking about that, is why do you never see anybody in Star Wars smelting or running a mill or anything like that? Instead, you see this, which I'm just going to assume is a large hunk of steel. If you crash that in the Mojave Desert, you'd have a scrap company out there breaking that thing apart tomorrow. It'd be a huge demolition job. But instead, it's just sitting out there. For whatever reason, nobody sees any commodity value in it. Instead, you have Ray, who's here in episode 7. She goes in there and she pulls out reusables from it. For whatever reason, there's just no commodity value there. But she definitely sees there's components within that ship that are worth pulling out. And it tells you a little bit about what commodity prices are in the Star Wars universe in whatever year that is. And what does she do? She then goes and sells it to this jerk who gives her like those little pellets that you pour water on and they become bread. He calls them portions. That's the recycling economy on Tatooine. I think it's Tatooine. So what's the deal? Well, there's an excess of commodities there. This is episode 3, and it's the famous fight between Anakin and Obi-Wan, and it's on a volcano planet, a mining planet. The whole planet is to be mined. It's all raw material, steel, who knows what it is. I looked on a Star Wars blog the other day, and they gave some weird metal name that I don't think actually exists. But the point is there's an excess of reserves. There's an excess of supply, so there's very little incentive at all to be opening smelters, to be melting this thing down and breaking it apart. There's a different kind of economy going on there, and I think that's something to keep in mind as we go through this. But to some extent, I think we've actually entered that kind of, on a smaller level, that kind of recycling universe for the time being. And at some point, Kent, we're going to have to do a scrap in the Star Wars feature for scrap. It'll be a lot of fun, trust me. All right. All right, so what I want to do is I want to talk about, before we get back to Star Wars, I want to talk a little bit about, yesterday's truths, things we were all sure about the scrap industry that were never going to change, that have now become today's myths or even falsehoods. We're running out. Scarcity. We are in for a period of inevitable permanent scarcity. Here's a world refined copper usage. I mean, you look at that and you say, how on earth will we ever have enough? The prices are going to keep going up and up and up and up. But of course, we all know, inflation adjusted, they really don't that much. And if you were in the business, if you're in copper, and I'm just going to do copper for right now, if you're in copper the last few years, you know that scarcity isn't making much of a difference. Where the prices are now, it's showing you that there's excess stocks. And in fact, that's precisely what's happened over recent years. These are the reported world copper reserves. This is U.S. government data. And it's amazing when you think about it. Between 2005 2015, 182 million metric ton of consumption worldwide. But look at all of those new reserves during that period as well. So it kind of pushes back against that scarcity narrative that so many of us have depended upon, I think, in terms of our long-term thinking. I don't think that you can do that anymore. I don't think you could do it in the first place. And why are we getting those reserves? Exploration, technology, and sheer economics. When copper goes, over $4 a pound, people are going to start exploring. So they're going to start justifying different kinds of technology. It's just like we have with, shale. Shale serves as kind of a cap on what the global oil price is going to be. There's just an excess of supply, and I think that's going to be the case for some time. I'm not saying the world will never run out, but it's going to be hard. This is a very interesting chart from the International Copper Study Group, and it's not to scale, but you can see just the kinds of reserves that are being predicted out there. And of course, some of them are going to be more expensive than just shoving a shovel into the ground. But those reserves are there, and there is, I would say, plenty of reason to believe that there's a ceiling on what prices can be. As prices rise, you're going to see those sorts of resources exploited more and more. And I think we could, make these kinds of statements for other resources that we think about when we're talking about recycling. Okay, here's the next myth. The next myth, is a truth, is really the part of this that runs from 1990 to 2010. Everybody believed that China's population and its working age population and its labor was forever. That there would be an excess of labor, low-cost labor, coming in from the countryside permanently. And that was very much the case for that 20-year period. And from 1990 to 2010, that was the boomiest part of the Chinese boom. And it's no accident that, especially 2000 to 2005, that working-age population expanded very quickly. It's basic economics. I mean, human resources, well-educated, good resources are going to help you grow an economy. But what happened right around 2010, and nobody's exactly sure what the date is, but they do know it's happening now, that working age population started shrinking. And it is in perpetual decline. And the Chinese government in particular is doing everything it can to reverse it, but you really can't, because this is something that's happened to every country in Asia and other places that's developed. Eventually the birth rate slows down and they start panicking. In China, they're allowing 2 children and 3 children now. The vaunted one-child policy is not to be anymore. They're encouraging childbirth. It didn't work in Singapore, and it's not going to work in China. So what does that mean on a practical level? This. Here you have wages. So I always call it the elephant in the Chinese scrap heap, because it's a big problem. And I think a lot of folks here have heard this, but you're talking about a 2.5 time increase in wages over a 10-year period. For the North American processors here, imagine if you just experienced that kind of wage increase. I mean, you probably wouldn't survive it. You'd certainly have to adjust. And it's just going to keep going up because the labor supply isn't there anymore. And that's a big problem for Chinese processors. It's also a big opportunity. On a practical level, this is 2002. In fact, this was taken early October 2002 on my first assignment for Kent, believe it or not. You know that photo. Yeah, and I mean, this was very common, and I was flabbergasted, I think, like so many other people were when they first walk into a Zorba sorting warehouse in China. This was Sigma's first warehouse, and I know a few people here were in there. You still have some of these, but you certainly don't have them in those kinds of numbers, and what's happened because of the rising labor costs is you have this. And this was taken in 2015 in Dalian, and I believe this was also on an assignment for you, Kent. And you start having this automation. You start having eddy currents. And really, if I didn't tell you this was in China, I mean, we have pickers in American yards, too, working alongside eddy currents. Maybe not quite like this, but if I told you this was Japan, I think many people would be willing to believe it. And this is really where things are trending in the future, because the price of labor is only going to get higher, and the margins are going to get tighter. And what does that mean? It means more automation. It's going to mean generally an increase in quality and an increase in standards. As good as Chinese labor was, it's never as good for standardization of a product as automation. So you're going to get a better standardized product for their mills and where they melt, and possibly, and we'll get into this a little bit, where they export. One more myth that really defined our past. And that is that, the building boom, the Chinese infrastructure boom, there would be a boom forever. This is the Chinese high-speed railway operation map as of a year ago. It's extraordinary what they built. I mean, thousands of miles of high-speed rail. Think about all that steel, all that copper. This is pretty much over. They continue to announce stimuli, but you're never going to see this kind of scale of infrastructure development in China again. It just can't happen. They've built it out, for the most part, enough. And so this is over as well. And so that growth within China is going to have to come from somewhere else, and it's going to be slower. And that's exactly what they're trying to restructure the economy to do, is to be a more service-oriented economy. So this final, and this is an ugly slide, but there's 2 words there that are very important how I'm thinking about the industry going forward. The next myth is really the 1990 to 2008. It's what I call the monopolar scrap trade. You could say in the 2000s, 1990s, and most of the 2000s, the world geopolitically was monopolar. The U.S. was the preeminent power. There were no other rivals. China and Russia have long envisioned a multipolar world. The monopolar scrap trade, as I see it, was really not so much one country at the center of it, but the way I think of it is really you had the trade going from developed countries, rich countries, to developing countries. The demand was in the developing countries, the supply was in the developed countries. That is not going to be the case anymore, and it's going to be a very big shift. What we're now going to see is much more trade between countries that we would think of as developing countries, and that's going to create a very, very big competitive pressure for the scrap traders and the countries that previously took for granted that they would be the world's suppliers. They're going to have to be competitive with other countries that they never in a million years thought they would compete with. So we're going to get into that a little bit. But first I want to look at the consumption side of this. This is a tremendous sort of visualization of a phenomenon that I think we all know is happening. But what I want you to just take away from it is look at what a shrinking percentage of the global auto market North America and Europe are now holding compared to what was the case in 1964. And that means a lot of things. It means, of course, you've got far more cars going on the road, sales-wise, in what we think of as the developing world than we do in the developed world. But it also will mean that there's going to be far more scrap being generated as a result of those cars. And I'm not just talking, obsolete cars, but I'm also talking manufacturing scrap, because most of those cars are being manufactured outside of the United States. So you could say that most of the manufacturing scrap for automobiles at this point is being generated in the developing world, and most of it primarily is being generated in China. I pulled this off a Bloomberg terminal just the other day, and it's just a very simple illustration of this point. On the left, these are passenger vehicle sales in China dating back to 2007, and they're up to, and people will disagree on some of these numbers. There's always in China, as you all know, the numbers are a little bit fuzzy. But say in 2016, we're talking about 25 million passenger vehicles in China. In the United States, same year, 18 million. And the reason these both crash at the bottom is it's actually the most up-to-date numbers. So actually, China's a little bit behind the U.S. in terms of sales this year by about 200,000 vehicles. But take a look at what the overall shape of that curve is. In China, it keeps going up, because there actually isn't that much automobile penetration in China at this point. You get out to the countryside, and very few people, as a percentage of the population, own cars, whereas you have, in the United States, pretty high car penetration. I mean, I don't know what the number is, maybe somebody in here would, but Americans own multiple cars, so it's going to be very hard to produce that kind of growth in the United States, and sure enough, you see the number in the United States plateauing, whereas even in 2008, 2009, China was growing, and that's a very important phenomenon for scrap generation. And again, this can apply to a lot of different products. But I just want to show you what this means. This was taken a couple years ago. I love this photo. It's an overhead photo of a ferrous scrapyard outside of Ningbo in China. And you had, as we all know, a couple years ago, the ferrous prices were in the tank. It was an absolute disaster. And so you had this kind of thing happening, and it reminds me a lot of this. Because at this point, there was no commodity value to be doing anything with this except pull the parts, and that was happening. So you do get these intermittent moments of sort of a time warp opening up and Luke Skywalker coming through, and that's outside of Ningbo. So it's not just about automobiles, though. This is just 2015. I tally these up just doing just a quick search on the Bloomberg. I mean, you can do this with almost any product out there. Almost any product, and these aren't all just steel products or copper products. I mean, sandals, you're talking about plastics, rubber, paper. China is the top consumer of paper in the world, and so all of those products are going to be obsolete at some point, but in the process of production, they're also generating large amounts of scrap. And so again, my message to you is China is about to become, and already is, a major, major generator of scrap. So let's look at this. This is actually from our friend Joe Pickard, the eminent economist associated with ISRI. He's the man to go to if you want data, and he gave me this, and I really appreciate it. We're going to see that trend from 2011 to 2015 continue. Now, if you look at that in the overall context, I mean, we're doing pretty damn good compared to 1996 or even 2006, but it will continue to decline. And what you need to be asking yourself as you look at the future of the scrap industry is why? Now, no doubt about it, we're not at the 12% growth period of the Chinese economy anymore. But the other thing, what I was just showing you, one of the reasons why, is this, is they are generating their own stuff. I would love to give you good statistics on how much they are generating, and I have seen the statistics, and I think the statistics are garbage, so I'm not going to put them up here because they really don't know. Nobody knows how much, but we know it's significant. I mean, China's the world's largest stainless consumer, but they actually don't use much stainless scrap. They're using nickel pig iron. Where is all that stainless going? Nobody knows, but it's got to be exported. So it's out there. We're feeling it, and that decline, without question, is in part, if not in large part, due to those growing volumes of Chinese domestic scrap. And that will be something that the North American trade and the European trade and the Australians and the Japanese, those members of monopolar scrap world, are going to have to deal with in the years to come. And I think it's coming very, very quickly. This is a really messy chart, but it tells us something very important. Let me explain to you what you're seeing here. This is actually a map. This was generated at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And what it shows in part is it tracks the flow of batteries, scrap batteries, everything but lead-acid batteries. So it'd be batteries you'd find in electronics. You can see there's countries listed here, USA all the way to the right. You have Japan all the way to the left. The blue dots represent countries that export those batteries. The yellow countries represent, they export to developing countries, other developed countries primarily. This is 1996. So the USA, for example, was sending those batteries to Europe, so blue to blue. That's developed country to developed country. The green line you see, the green lines, the light green lines, are batteries sent from developed countries to developing countries. And the yellow dots and lines are developing countries that are sending batteries to developing countries. So it's a big tangle. This is 1996. But I want you to see what happens in 2012. We're going to jump ahead 16 years. See all that yellow? Suddenly there's a lot more yellow there. Developing countries trading with developing countries, these batteries. This is very hard data to crunch, but they did this. And what does that mean? Well, you've suddenly got people buying computers in places like the Maldives and Sri Lanka. And when they recycle them, they're going to send them to other developing countries. It's not just going to be Sweden sending its batteries to China. It's suddenly going to be the Maldives sending its batteries to China, which means that the scrap guy in Sweden who thought he had the market all to himself is now competing to some guy in an island in the Maldives. Let me give you a more detailed look at what this means. Here is China and Hong Kong in 1996. No trading in and or out of there, because actually at that period, Korea and Japan were the ones primarily getting these types of batteries. Now let's jump forward to 2012. Look at that trading network. This is the overall, and you can see on the right, there's the mutual trade, you have incoming and you have outgoing. So you can see what's happening here is you have this emerging giant yellow dot that is China. And it's sort of balancing out that big blue dot there. I talked to the guys at Memorial. They haven't really been able to do this with straight commodities, but this is pretty extraordinary stuff on its own. And it's, I think it tells us quite a bit. Now, this is all something that just kind of happened. It's wonderful. The market does what the market is going to do. But from China's perspective, this is all in their interest. They want to see, I don't think of this in military terms, but they want to see their commercial influence grow, and their biggest rival is going to be the United States. So as their commercial influence grows, they become an economic rival to the U.S. That gives them the opportunity to set global trading rules, have a bigger voice in things like the UN, and because they are a bigger trading country. And so what are they doing now? What have they started thinking about doing? Let's formalize this. Has anybody here, how many people here have heard of One Belt, One Road? Okay, good. Joe has heard of it, and David. So One Belt, One Road, if you don't know about it, it's really worth looking up. It's a $4 trillion, basically, logistics plan on the part of the Chinese government to build themselves a trading hub that extends from China all the way into Europe. And it's a complete Eurasian trading market with logistical hubs that span the entire continents, rail, and also a sea. So they're building ports, they're building rail lines from those ports, and all of those ports point back to China. I just want to be clear, I don't look at this as a sinister thing. There's certainly, there's been a lot of debate what the military purposes of this are, but I really do believe that what they're doing here is just trying to achieve on a global level what they did in China. They looked at places that didn't have ports, didn't have good logistical networks, and they said, let's build ports, let's build logistics, and see things grow up around it. And they're doing it. So far, $250 billion has been earmarked. Crucially, many people might have heard of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is now the new rival to the IMF. If you see the countries that are in red there, they're all contributing to that. And the primary purpose of the AIIB is to fund this development. So let's go a little deeper into it. What does this mean? Right now, and I don't think people fully appreciate just the meaning of this, 2/3 of the world's top 50 container ports have some degree of Chinese ownership. And that's going to grow because they're investing in new ports all over Asia and all over Africa. Now, again, there may very well be military reasons for this, but in large part, what they're doing is trying to create logistical networks to strengthen their commercial hand. And they're doing it. and they're subsidizing it. And this is the other part of it. They also have very large container companies now. I mean, they're the world's biggest shipping nation. So 2/3 of container traffic passes through Chinese-owned or invested ports on Chinese boats. What that means is they have the opportunity not just to shape trade, but to subsidize it and shape it. And they're doing that. They want to see all trade revolving around China. Why not? So let's look at what this means with a very practical example. Anybody here ever been to Yiwu? Oh, you should all go. It's fantastic. No, it's the greatest place. All right, Yiwu is not far from Ningbo and Taizhou, and I know people here have been to those places. Yiwu is the world's biggest wholesale market. All the little bits and pieces of junk we all own. Here's 2 examples. It's the world's biggest manufacturer of clocks. Famously, the world's biggest manufacturer of lighters. If you have a lighter in your pocket, no question it was made in Yiwu. In Junkyard Planet, I mentioned this, and I got it from actually, probably shouldn't say who, but they import or they bring into Yiwu, whether via imports or domestically, around reportedly 500 tons of brass per year to help in the manufacture of lighters. It's an extraordinarily important place. But every knickknack you own, the world's Christmas tree industry, ornament industry, it's all in Yiwu. And you walk down the streets and you'll have the clock street, then you'll have the lighter street, then you'll have the microphone street. It's just incredible. The Penn Street is like Penn superhighway, so it's really something else. Well, look what China is doing right now. They just opened this up earlier this month. This is a dedicated rail line. It takes 18 days that runs from London to Yiwu. Heavily subsidized to the tune of $1,000 to $3,000 per car, which is container, which is damn expensive. But what does that do for them? You know, they look at it as a long-term investment in building out the economies along that route. And what's on the backhauls? Well, you know, the first train that went a couple weeks ago, they were loading it up with whiskey and various types of luxury goods from the UK that are going to make their way across Eurasia to Yiwu. But we all know what they can send from Yiwu back to Europe. Again, it's totally uneconomical, but they don't care for right now. The idea is to build the logistical networks and see where the chips may fall. And if they're willing to continue spending the money, sooner or later the chips are going to fall into economic development along that route, and they are going to alter trade routes for the rest of the world. So you can see that route. Actually, this is older. This is from the Merex group in Germany. But you get the idea. It's just that's just one rail line. They've got a lot more that are not actually filled in here that is building this new Eurasian logistical network. And it's extraordinary. Just to point out, you know, what's happening in the developing countries, if you go down to Africa and you look at Djibouti there, you'll see 2 rail lines. The Chinese are building a port. They've completed it, and they've just opened up the rail line from Djibouti down to Kenya and into Ethiopia. It's never been there before. Suddenly you are opening up Djibouti, Ethiopia, and parts of Kenya to trade that never had the chance before. And who are they going to trade with? They're going to trade with the people who own the ports and who have the subsidized containers and the subsidized shipping. So this is altering how trade flows go. And it will, as we all know, because scrap is half the battle is logistics, it's going to alter how scrap flows. How precisely, we don't know yet. But I know for fact that on one of the northern rail routes that's opened that goes through Russia, I know of 2 e-scrap recyclers in Eastern Europe who are using it to send e-scrap back to China. So that's one small example. I mean, will it make sense to be sending ferrous along that thing? No. And even a lot of non-ferrous, probably not. It still makes more sense to send it via sea, but they're building the ports and the infrastructure to do that. Well, the other key here, just in the short term here, if we go just look at Southeast Asia, you'll see there's a lot of activity there, and that's really the primary focus. We talked about the rail line, but Southeast Asia for China is its backyard, and there's political reasons for that. But just to highlight Southeast Asia, we know what the ASEAN member countries are. These are some of the fastest growing economies in the world, and China is subsidizing the building of infrastructure to link them more closely to it than to the United States. And I'm not here to make a political statement at all, but it's, you know, when the TPP fell apart, this was really exciting to the Chinese because they're building the trading networks, the logistical networks, and they're working on building the trade agreements to replace it. What is ASEAN and why is China so enthusiastic about being a part of it? Well, I mean, you're talking about 625 million people, and again, look at the the foreign exchange reserves, the GDP. It's extraordinary, and that is now being linked directly physically into China and the rest of this Eurasian trading network. And you are seeing within Malaysia, where I live now, you're seeing a lot of Chinese scrap flowing down there for processing and then moving back up. And just in terms of what the growth is going to be there over the coming years, this is a survey done a couple years ago with CEOs in North America and Europe who have foreign operations, and it's talking about where they're going to relocate over the next few years. And you see large numbers of CEOs locating new factories in Myanmar, in Indonesia, which is absolutely booming right now, and you see also companies moving into Malaysia. So that's what the Chinese are linking themselves up to, and that's going to make it easier for them to get the scrap in and out of those places. So again, this is worth following. You know, it's a tough thing with a lot of Chinese projects. There's no deadline on it. They're just going to keep doing it. They've earmarked $4 trillion. When they'll spend all that $4 trillion, who knows? But they're doing it. They are actively doing it. There's a major conference, I believe it's next week in Beijing, where you have heads of state from Europe coming in to see how they can get on this bandwagon. But it's going to disrupt the overall global scrap trade. Let me give you a couple of practical examples on how it's actually altering scrap. This is an email I got about 10 days ago from somebody in Guinea-Conakry. Look at all that scrap. Why they sent it to me, I have no idea. I guess I'm associated with the trade, but they sent it to my Bloomberg address. But I never used to get offers of scrap. I don't buy scrap, but offers of scrap like this from West Africa. So I called up the guy. And I just started talking to him, and I was curious about the logistics. And sure enough, the logistics are Chinese logistics. The Chinese port investments are what make this possible. For this guy to, reach out to a journalist in Malaysia and say, maybe you can buy my scrap. Had the Chinese not invested in that kind of port infrastructure, this would not be a realistic sale. I don't know what would be happening to that scrap, but it certainly wouldn't be coming my way. If anybody wants access to this, let me know afterwards, and I can forward the email to you. Here's something else that's coming. Again, I took this off the Bloomberg terminal the other day. We have so little data, but these are non-ferrous base metal exports from China. This is total in tonnages over the last 10 years. It's nothing. But we know that there's much more than that. It's once in a while it gets picked up. But my point in showing this to you is that it's going to get bigger. And again, this is going to be competition for not just North American scrap dealers, but it'll be competition for Japan, I think even more immediately, because this scrap is going to start moving into Asia more quickly than it moves into North America. But North America will be competing with the Japanese on that. So again, this is what it looked like in 2012, and this is what your scrap world is going to look like going forward. It's multipolar, and that yellow dot on the left side, which is China, is going to get bigger and bigger, and more trade is going to revolve around it. And it's not just going to be funky batteries. It's going to be a lot of different commodities. A couple of just observations as I wrap this up on what the future looks like. Some folks here have been here. This is the website for the Shanghai Futures Exchange. I firmly believe at some point in the next 10 years, people in this room are going to start quoting prices out of Shanghai and not the LME. China's footprint is too big. RMB internationalization is too far along for the Shanghai Futures Exchange to remain irrelevant forever. And it's already, I know it's being used for pricing in Southeast Asia, just as the RMB is being used for settlement, and that's going to grow. Whether it becomes the global standard, I don't know, but it's going to rival it, and it makes sense. If I'm Chinese, I would expect it would. They're the big player, and the Shanghai Futures Exchange will be something that you will be referencing as you quote prices. The future, I believe, for successful scrap traders in this multipolar world is going to require digging deeper. I've been wanting to show this photo forever. This was taken in Guangzhou. What these are batteries that were pulled out of laptops. They broke out the individual cells, build cases to test them. They see how much life they have in them, segregate them, wrap them up in new battery cases, and sell them back into Chinese markets. They're digging deeper. We would never do that here for a lot of reasons, including safety reasons. But the point is, the Chinese are constantly trying to find new ways to get value out of what they have coming into their yards in ways that perhaps we wouldn't or even shouldn't do in this country. And it's not just going to be the reuse markets, it's going to be the commodities as well. Here's another recent picture. Quality. I really believe more and more quality is going to dictate how you are successful or not in the global scrap trade. This was taken in Benin, the capital of Benin, just a couple months ago, and this was really striking to me. These are really large basketball shoes, like we're talking size 15 type shoes, and they've been worn once or twice. And asking around, they came out of either a university or a professional program somewhere in the United States, made their way to Benin, and are being sold for a premium in Benin. I mean, how great is that? Once or twice, you just need people with big enough feet to fit them. My point in showing you this is North American quality and European quality of scrap is still much, much higher than what you're going to find in these developing countries, because we scrap things much younger. Just simply, the paper has less recycled fiber in it. There's less oxidization on the steel, and so that's going to continue to be a great advantage. And that kind of quality, the quality that can be generated in these developed country markets, is still high, and that will still be a premium. So if you will find yourself competing much harder on quality than ever before. You are going to want to be the guy with the size 15 basketball shoes that were only worn once. And finally, and I'm bringing this up because this is my current interest. My next book is actually going to be largely on repair and reuse. But the future is, for the electronic space, is going to be repair and reuse more and more, and it's going to be automobiles as well. And I think there's going to be a good 10, 15-year window as Africa industrializes, where you're going to see really good opportunities to be sending stuff into developing markets that would have been shredded or scrapped in other ways, now made available for repair. And it's extraordinary, the repair industries that you see emerging in places like Benin, in Ghana, in Nigeria, which is a population of at least 180 million people, and that will have a profound influence, I believe, on the trade of electronic scrap, and also on some trade related to automobiles. And I think in time, at least for a brief 10, 15 years, we will be looking at a scrap trade that in some places it resembles more what's in the Jawa sand crawler than perhaps what's in your warehouse. So at that, I'm going to wrap this and open everything up to questions.
Let's hear it from our speaker. Thank you, Adam, for that presentation. A lot of food for thought in there, some positive and some nerve-wracking maybe. Anyway, does anybody have any questions out there to get started? I have some of my own, but let's start with the audience first. Anybody want to ask Adam a question? Yes, Michael?
Adam, what about the safety, EPA regulations or environmental regulations? On my first trip to China in '94, they were cooking boards in frying pans, and the smoke was coming up, and they were taking the chips off. And what has changed since then?
Am I coming through the mic? Okay. Well, I think on balance, if we're just going to talk about China, the safety and environmental has improved considerably over the 15 years that I've been, exploring the various regions of China where you have scrap. I mean, the frying of circuit boards in places like Guiyu. If you went to Guiyu, say in 2005, that's the notorious e-waste town that you saw in the 60 Minutes episode. You knew you were getting into town for two reasons. One, about 2 miles away, you could smell it because the smell of a boiling circuit board is unmistakable, and two, you could see it because the smoke, hovering over the horizon from the burning of wire. About 5 years, even more than that, probably about 6, 7 years ago, the smoke on the horizon disappeared, and you had to get much closer to town to smell the burning circuit boards, which is a genuine improvement. They started figuring out that they could actually make more money with those circuit boards if they exported them to Japan. And in Japan, they're going to be handled much better, if they go to a Dowa or a Mitsubishi, or I don't think much is going to Umicore. So, I mean, in China, you've seen a general improvement in the environmental situation. I think Green Fence had a huge influence on improving the operations of the plastics industry. There's still a long way to go in China. I shouldn't say I've never been in a scrap plant in China that would meet U.S. OSHA standards, but let's just say they're few and far between, and maybe that will never be the standard there, and it probably won't. Other countries, I just spent time in West Africa, and there's no big yards in those places, but you see how the scrap is handled. It's incredibly dangerous, and I mean they're where China was 20, 25 years ago. I think India is right at the start of its evolution. I believe India is going to evolve very, very rapidly because their wages are moving up quickly as well. I mean, that's the other thing that's driven the improvement in Chinese yard conditions is, if you're starting, the difference between paying, somebody you're paying $500 a month and somebody you're paying $1,000 a month and they're harder to get, you're going to want to treat them better. And that's happened. So I think the general trend is good, but when you get into these really early developing areas, it's very bad.
Any other questions for Adam? Yes,
Adam,
David.
on the Silk Road, and ports, what about Chinese ownership or influence in ports in the United States? How have they penetrated there? It seems to me there was something a few years ago, even with the Port Authority.
Yeah, David asked about Chinese influence, and David Wallace of Huron Valley asked about Chinese influence on ports in the U.S. if they're buying. On that map, they do have ownership in ports in the U.S., but I don't believe they have majority ownership of any. And we should distinguish about what Chinese ownership means, because Chinese ownership is both Hong Kong and mainland Chinese ownership. So Hutchinson Whampoa, which is a very big Hong Kong operator of ports, they've been operating ports both in Hong Kong and outside of Hong Kong for years and years. I think how tightly connected they are with the overall Chinese government program to sort of subtly, slowly bend trade in certain directions. You can't say, but I believe Hutchinson Whampoa has investments in the U.S. But in the U.S. at this point, there are Chinese with investments in it, but there's no Chinese owned and operated port in the U.S. But you definitely are starting to see them in Europe and all over Africa.
Any other questions from the audience? Well, I have one. Adam, you talked a lot about metals and electronics. Do you have any vision of paper and plastics and how they might fit into that Star Wars universe you described?
Well, the interesting thing about paper is the domestic supply of paper, and actually, I should have thought to put I actually have a slide. The domestic supply of paper in China has grown very rapidly, and now the majority of fiber being recycled in China is domestically sourced, and that's a big, big change because for years it was imported. And so what's happening now in China is they're really working hard to improve the quality. But I think in terms of the paper industry, I think we're seeing this almost the leader on this. Plastic, again, we saw the green fence, and now we have the national sword enforcement, and of course those enforcements are focused very heavily on mixed plastics. And one of the reasons is that the government has been very actively trying to upgrade the domestic plastics industry in China, which is, I think, of the various major sectors of recycling in China, that's the one that's probably the most damaging environmentally and the most dangerous. And because of the enforcement actions, you're actually seeing more Chinese plastic entering the marketplace there. In terms of how they fit into the Star Wars, universe of things, I mean, we certainly are reaching an interesting point with the oil markets and plastic, and there's no, I think, commodity, recycling commodity that's more closely related to its raw material as scrap plastics and oil. So it'll be interesting to see how oversupply might impact that.
Thank you.
Oh,
we have a question from the audience.
Yeah.
From
well,
Joe
I gotta go,
Pickard.
Joe, actually.
Joe Pickard, ISRI's chief economist and director of commodities. This is going to be a good one.
No, probably not. Great presentation as always, Adam.
Thanks, man.
Sorry you're saddled with this particular moderator, but that's the way it goes. In the movement you're talking about from the monopolar to the multipolar,
Yeah.
would you say that's entirely to the detriment of the U.S. scrap exporters, or are there any sort of silver linings in that?
Right, yeah, there are silver linings. I mean, one that, theoretically that opens up markets for them as well. I mean, if a country is exporting scrap, they might very well be an importer of scrap, but it is going to mean more work. I mean, the U.S. exporter of scrap had this great situation for, a good 15 years where it was very easy to find somebody to buy your scrap. There was lots and lots of Chinese buyers coming to you. The new future is you are going to have to work harder to find those markets. But there will potentially be more markets. And so that's a net positive. I mean, I'm a believer that trade does lift all boats, but it's going to be harder. The days of just, being able to say, I have scrap and people come running to you, those are over. You're going to have to prove more.
Does anybody have any comment about Adam's prediction that prices will shift from referring to the London Metal Exchange to the Shanghai Stock Exchange? Anybody want to comment on that, or think it's good, bad, or indifferent? Would that make you nervous? Crickets. Crickets.
It
Right,
mean-
I think that means they're thinking about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I have another question though. All right, you talked quite a bit about Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Is there potentially an even bigger role for Africa in the future, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the window for, I mean, I've been spending time there, and it's fascinating, and everybody should go spend time in Africa and see what's happening with those economies, because they're emerging, but it's going to take time. It's a much longer investment. Southeast Asia is happening now. Most of Africa, even places where I think you're going to see huge booms in coming years like Nigeria, I really think they're probably about 10 years out. But what's so interesting about what China's doing is they did this in China, and they're doing it in Africa. They're building infrastructure early. They're building highways to nowhere, railroads that have very little capacity. And if you went to China, say in 1992, and saw what they were doing in Shanghai, you'd say, why are they building these wide boulevards on the other side of the river? Nobody's ever going to drive their cars down that. Now they're filled with traffic jams, and that's their model, and they believe they can make it work in these places, and I guess we'll see, but I think the opportunity in Africa is very long term. I know a few North American scrap dealers who are exploring it. It's tough because the shipping is very expensive from either coast, but I think for the Chinese it's going to be a much better opportunity because they've built this port infrastructure, they have these shipping companies, and they will have the logistics to make it happen.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you for coming to the mic.
But I'm very bullish on Africa.
Being that North America may have better quality of scrap, will we be able to call for a more premium price on our scrap than the actual market?
I don't know. Let me know. I'm not sure. I mean, in theory, quality. I mean, y'all are in the business. I mean, quality can, if you can do it in volume, quality demands a premium. It's traditionally so in the business, so why not?
So keep working for quality. Anything else? Going once? Going twice? Well, thank you, Adam, again for a great presentation. We appreciate it. Thank you all again for coming to the convention and this session in particular. We hope we will see you in Las Vegas in 2018. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a great afternoon and a great time at the party tonight.